I'm 84 years old, and the day I stopped chasing success was the day my life finally began. I used to think the day I made my first $1 million would feel like arriving somewhere. I was wrong about that. My name is Harold. I'm 84 years old, and it took me most of my life to understand that everything I spent those years running toward was never actually the destination. Let me start at the beginning, because I think that's the only honest place to start. I grew up a small house in eastern Ohio, the kind of house where the walls were thin enough that you could hear your father worrying at night. Not arguing, not shouting, just worrying. That low, quiet sound of a man lying awake in the dark, turning the same numbers over in his mind. The way you'd turn a stone in your hand, hoping the underside might look different than you remembered. My father worked at a steel mill for 31 years. He was a decent man, a careful man, and he was afraid almost every single day of his life that what he had wouldn't be enough. I decided sometime around the age of 9 or 10 that I was not going to be that man. Now I want to be careful here, because I loved my father, and I understand him now in ways I never could when he was alive. But a child doesn't understand nuance. A child sees fear and decides to become the opposite of fear. And the opposite of fear, when you're 10 years old in a thin-walled house in Ohio, looks a lot like money. It looks like a big car and a brick house and a briefcase and a name that people recognize when you walk into a room. So I aimed at all of that. Quietly, methodically, the way my father aimed at survival. Except I aimed higher. I was a serious student, not because I loved learning, but because I understood early on that grades were a ladder rung, and I intended to climb. I got a scholarship to Ohio State, which felt like proof that my plan was working. I studied business, graduated near the top of my class, went to work for a manufacturing company in Cleveland, and began what I would later describe as a career built on drive and discipline. And it was. I don't want to pretend otherwise. Whatever I achieved in those years, I earned through genuine effort. I worked long hours, not because anyone forced me to, but because work was the only arena where I felt fully in control, where effort had a measurable and predictable relationship with outcome. You put in the hours, you made the calls, you solved the problems, and the results reflected that. Life outside of work was messier, less legible, harder to optimize. So I spent most of my time where the feedback was clear. By the time I was 35, I had been promoted 3 times. By 40, I was running a division. By 48, I was a partner in a private equity firm I had helped to build. We made acquisitions, turned companies around, sold them, moved on. I was good at it. I had a talent for seeing where value was being left on the table and figuring out how to capture it. People respected that talent. They paid for it generously. And I collected those payments the way I had collected good grades as a boy, as evidence that I was succeeding at the project of not becoming someone to be afraid for. My wife's name was Eleanor. We met at a party in Columbus when I was 24, and she married me a year later, which I have always considered one of the more fortunate things that ever happened to me, though I didn't always treat it that way. Eleanor was warm in ways that I was not, socially fluent in ways that I found slightly mysterious, possessed of a genuine curiosity about other people's interior lives that I simply didn't share at that point in my existence. She made friends easily and kept them for decades. She remembered birthdays and showed up when people were sick, and laughed at the right moments in conversation without calculating whether laughter was the appropriate response. We had 3 children together. David, who was born in 1968, then Patricia 2 years later, and our youngest, Robert, in 1972. I was present at each of their births in the physical sense of the word, which is about as far as presence extended during most of their childhoods. I was not an unkind father. I never raised a hand to them or spoke to them with cruelty. I went to the important events, the graduation ceremonies, the school plays, the occasional soccer game, when I could arrange my schedule around it. I provided everything they needed in the material sense and most of what they wanted. But I was not, if I'm speaking plainly, really there. My mind was elsewhere almost constantly. Even when I was sitting at the dinner table, or helping someone with homework, or standing in a gymnasium watching a child receive an award, some part of me was still in the office, still running numbers, still solving problems that had nothing to do with the people in front of me. Eleanor understood this better than I did, which is to say she understood it clearly, while I barely understood it at all. She made accommodations for it in the way that patient people make accommodations for something they cannot change, building her life around my absences the way a river builds itself around a stone. She raised our children with a warmth and consistency that I could admire from a distance without fully participating in it. She cultivated her friendships, her garden, her book club, her involvement in the local church. And she never demanded that I join her in any of it with the kind of ultimatum that might have forced a genuine confrontation. She simply continued being herself, which was quietly remarkable, and waited, I think, with more patience than I ever deserved, for me to become someone who could see what was in front of him. By my mid-50s, I had achieved most of what I had set out to achieve. Not everything, because ambition has a way of redefining its own finish line, but enough that a reasonable observer looking at my life from the outside would have said that man has done well for himself. The house was large and well furnished. The children were grown and educated and making their own ways in the world. The business was profitable and respected. The car in the driveway was the kind that turns heads. And I was, by any external measure, a success. I remember sitting in my office one evening in 1997. I was 57 years old, after a deal had closed that I had been working toward. It was a significant deal, the kind that changes the shape of a company, and it had gone almost exactly as I had planned, which was satisfying in a technical sense, the way solving a difficult equation is satisfying, the pleasure of correctness, of precision rewarded. My assistant had already gone home. The building was quiet. I sat in my chair and looked out at the city and waited for whatever feeling was supposed to come next. And almost nothing came. There was a faint relief, the kind you feel when something stressful is over. There was a brief, almost clinical awareness of having executed well. And then there was a silence that I didn't know what to do with. Not an empty silence exactly, but a questioning one. A silence that seemed to be asking, and now what? I didn't stay with that question very long. I was 57 years old and had spent decades learning not to sit still with uncomfortable questions. So I filed it away, the way you file a piece of paper you're not sure what to do with, and moved on to the next thing on my list. That was a mistake, but I didn't know it yet. The next decade was in many ways a continuation of the one before it. More deals, more travel, more of the structured, purposeful momentum. But things were also beginning to shift beneath the surface in ways I was only dimly aware of. My oldest, David, had started his own family, and I found myself a grandfather for the first time in 2001, which produced a feeling I hadn't anticipated and didn't entirely know how to categorize. It was softer than most of the feelings I was accustomed to, less transactional, entirely unrelated to effort or outcome or strategy. His daughter, my granddaughter Emma, simply looked at me with those enormous dark eyes and grabbed my finger, and it was as though something in my chest made a sound. I hadn't heard in a very long time. I didn't know what to do with that either. So I admired her from a careful distance and told myself I was giving her parents space to parent, which was partly true and partly the story I was telling myself to avoid something I couldn't name. Eleanor got sick in 2006, breast cancer, caught early enough that the prognosis was cautiously optimistic, but serious enough that the word terminal entered our conversations as a possibility rather than a certainty, and that was sufficient to change the atmosphere of our house in ways that no amount of money could regulate or control. I stayed close during that time, closer than I had been in years. not out of some sudden spiritual awakening, but out of something more animal and immediate. The kind of presence that fear produces when it finally becomes impossible to sublimate into productivity. I went with her to appointments. I learned the vocabulary of her treatment. I sat with her in the evenings in a way I had rarely sat with anyone, without agenda, without a phone in my hand, just present in the room while she rested or read or talked about things that had nothing to do with illness. She recovered. The treatment worked, and within 2 years she was, by every medical measure, healthy. But something had shifted during that period, not traumatically, not in any single conversation or revelation, but gradually, the way light changes. In the late afternoon, without you noticing, until suddenly the room looks different than it did an hour ago. I began to notice things. That's the most accurate way I can describe it. I began to actually notice the life that had been occurring just outside my peripheral vision for 30-odd years. The way Eleanor moved through the house in the morning, comfortable in her own skin in a way that I had never quite managed. The quality of a meal she had cooked, not just the taste but the intention behind it, the fact that she had thought about what I liked and made it for me. The conversations she had on the phone with her oldest friends, conversations full of a kind of warmth and history and mutual knowledge that I had not cultivated with anyone outside of a professional context. I began to understand, slowly and without drama, that she had built something while I had been building something else, and that what she had built was, by the measure of my 58, 59, 60-year-old self, considerably more substantial. I retired at 63, not because I wanted to exactly, but because something in me had started to resist the old momentum. The drive that had felt so natural for so long had begun to feel not exactly false, but unnecessary. Like I was still running in a race that had already ended, out of habit rather than genuine desire. I announced my retirement to my partners, wrapped up my obligations, and one morning in the spring of 2003 found myself without a structured professional purpose. It was not comfortable. I had no idea what to do with an unscheduled Tuesday. I had no hobbies that I had developed with any seriousness. I had spent 40 years defining myself through work. Without that framework, I felt genuinely disoriented, like a man walking into a room with all the furniture removed. I played golf badly, read books I couldn't stay interested in, took walks that felt purposeless. I spent a not insignificant amount of time sitting in my study, telling myself I should be relaxing and feeling anything but relaxed. Eleanor watched all of this with characteristic patience and refrained mostly from pointing out that she had told me. She said it once, gently, after about 3 months of watching me drift around the house like a man looking for his keys. She said, "Harold, you spent 40 years feeding one part of yourself. The other parts are hungry." And then she went back to her book, and I sat with that for a while. She was right, of course. She was right in the way that people who pay attention are right, which is completely and a little painfully. I started spending time in the garden that summer, not because I had any particular feeling about gardens, but because Eleanor spent time there. It was somewhere to be, something to do with my hands that wasn't email or phone calls or analysis. She showed me what she was growing, explained what needed attention and why, told me the names of things. And I began, tentatively, and with very little natural aptitude, to learn. It was slower than anything I had ever done professionally. Plants do not respond to urgency. They grow on their own schedule, regardless of your intentions or your efficiency. The learning curve is long and uneven and full of failure that doesn't resolve neatly into a lesson. I killed things. I misidentified problems. I watered incorrectly and pruned at the wrong times and made beginner mistakes. But something about that slowness began to do something to me that I can only describe as therapeutic. It began to change the rhythm of my attention. In the office, I had always been managing several things at once, holding multiple problems in mind simultaneously, moving quickly between contexts, because speed was a value and multitasking was a skill. In the garden, that approach was not only useless, but actively counterproductive. The garden required you to look at one thing, to be where you were. I remember the day I'm about to describe with a clarity that surprises me. It was a Thursday in early September, 2004. I was 64 years old. Eleanor had gone to visit a friend. I was alone in the backyard with no particular plan for the next several hours. I had been working in the garden for a little over a year, well enough that I no longer felt entirely incompetent, though I still had a great deal to learn. I was sitting on a low wooden bench near the back fence, where Eleanor had planted a row of dahlias. They were in full bloom. They were extraordinary. That's the only word I have for them. The kind of red that doesn't look like it belongs in nature. Almost aggressively alive against the late summer green around them. I sat there looking at them for probably 10 minutes. Before I realized I had been sitting there for 10 minutes. In my previous life, 10 unstructured minutes would have produced anxiety. The feeling of time wasting, of being behind, of something I should be doing that I was failing to do. But I was just sitting there, and I was not anxious. I was, for the first time in longer than I could accurately remember, simply present. Not planning, not reviewing, not measuring or analyzing or anticipating. Just there, on that bench, looking at those flowers. And it was in that stillness that the question I had filed away in my office in 1997, "And now what?" came back. Except it didn't come back as a question. It came back as something closer to an answer, or the beginning of one. What I understood, sitting in that garden on that Thursday afternoon, was not complicated. It wasn't a revelation in the dramatic sense. It didn't arrive with music or light, or a sudden reconstruction of my entire worldview. It arrived quietly, the way most true things arrive when you finally stop making enough noise to hear them. I had spent my life running from my father's fear. That was the whole story. I had looked at that thin-walled house in Ohio, at that careful man lying awake doing arithmetic in the dark, and I had decided that I would not be afraid the way he was afraid. And so I had built fortifications against fear. Wealth, reputation, achievement, control, the accumulation of evidence that I was sufficient, that I was more than sufficient, that I had risen above the thing I was afraid of becoming, and I had succeeded at that project entirely. I had built every fortification I set out to build, and I had spent so much time building that I had never actually stopped to ask whether the fear was still there, waiting behind the walls I'd constructed, or whether it had ever been as dangerous as I believed, or whether the life I was fortifying myself against was actually, in some ways I hadn't considered, a life worth understanding, rather than escaping. My father was afraid, yes, but he was also there. He was at the dinner table every night. He knew our names, our teachers' names, our friends' names, the names of the things we cared about. He was afraid almost every day. And he was also, in the ways that I was only beginning to understand mattered, genuinely present. He gave us himself. Not the curated, high-performing, successful version of himself. Just himself, in his entirety, including the fear and the worry. And I had given my children a version of myself that I had spent 40 years optimizing for external presentation. I had given them the successful herald, the capable herald, the herald who solved problems and provided things. I had not given them the herald who was afraid or uncertain or who didn't know what he was doing, because that herald was the one I had been running from since I was 9 years old, sitting there in the garden. I understood that my children probably knew me less well than I had known my father. And my father, by any external measure, had given me considerably less. That realization was not comfortable. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't one of those gentle, warming moments of self-understanding that resolve into peaceful acceptance. It was more like setting down a very heavy piece of luggage and discovering that your back had been damaged by carrying it, and that some of that damage was permanent. There was grief in it, genuine grief, not for the success I had spent my life pursuing, which had been real, and which I did not regret exactly, but for the years inside that pursuit that had gone by without my full attention, for the version of myself that my children deserved to know and didn't, for the conversations with Eleanor that should have happened decades before they did. I sat with that grief on that bench in that garden for a long time. I didn't try to solve it or improve it, or develop an action plan for addressing it, which would have been my instinct at almost any previous point in my life. I just let it be what it was. And then I went inside and called David, not to say any of the things I'm telling you now. I wasn't ready for that kind of conversation yet, and neither was he. I just called to talk, which was unusual enough, that he asked if everything was all right. I told him yes, I just wanted to catch up. We talked for about 40 minutes. About his work and his children and a television show he and his wife had been watching, and it was ordinary in every way, and I held on to every word of it. I made a different choice that day, not a dramatic one. No grand announcements or tearful apologies or declarations of transformation. Just a quiet internal reorientation. I decided to start paying attention to the life in front of me, the way I had spent 40 years paying attention to the life I was trying to build. That sounds simple. It was not simple. Habits of mind that you've spent decades developing do not dissolve because you've decided they should. I backslid constantly. I caught myself planning during conversations, being physically present and mentally elsewhere, reaching for my phone when I should have been paying attention to the person across from me. I had to learn slowly and with real effort, something that Eleanor had apparently been doing naturally her entire life, which is to say, I had to learn to want what I actually had. I started asking my children questions I had never thought to ask before, not about their careers or their plans, or the kind of accomplishments I could file under something to be proud of, but about their actual experiences of their own lives. What they found difficult, what surprised them, what they wished they understood better. These conversations were awkward at first, because I was asking them in a way that was clearly new, and they knew it was new, and there was a period of calibration. Patricia, my daughter, the one who has her mother's directness, said to me about a year after that afternoon in the garden, "Dad, where did you go for the first 30 years of my life, and what did you do with my father?" She said it with a kind of wry humor that I recognized as a coping mechanism, which is to say she meant it seriously enough. I told her I hadn't gone anywhere. I'd just been somewhere else inside my own head. She nodded as if that confirmed something. She had suspected for a long time, and then we both sat quietly for a moment, and then she told me about something her daughter had done at school that week, and we moved on, which is how families repair things, not in a single conversation, but in the accumulation of many small ones. Harold, elderly, sitting on the garden bench, looking at the dahlias, a peaceful smile on his face, truly present and content. Golden hour light. Eleanor and I grew closer in those years than we had ever been, which I recognize as extraordinary. What changed was not our circumstances or our affection, but my availability. I was finally there in a way that matched my physical presence, and that changed everything. We traveled some, had long dinners, and longer conversations. We went back to Ohio once. The house was smaller than I remembered, and the neighborhood had changed in decades. I thought about that boy who decided, in that house, what kind of man he would become. He was just a frightened kid, afraid of inheriting his father's fear. Everything that followed was him running as fast as he could, never outrunning the fear inside. I thought about my father more in those years than in the previous 4 decades. I tried to understand his life from the inside, with patience, without judgment. He was a child during the Depression, a young man during the Second World War. His fear wasn't weakness. It was the rational response of a man who had seen things collapse. I had taken his fear as a warning, missing that it was evidence of survival and showing up. I wish I could tell him he was a better father than I was for most of my adult life. The thing I spent 40 years trying not to inherit was the least important thing about him. The most important things, presence, consistency, showing up, I left on the table. I was trying to acquire things that turned out to matter far less. He died in 1985, the year I made partner. I felt complicated grief. I didn't have time to sit with it, an achievement I wasn't sure how to feel about. I went to the funeral, came back, and went back to work. That's how I managed. I'm telling you this now because I'm 84. There's something clarifying about this age. Not wisdom exactly, but more like the view from a height. You can see more from up here. The shapes of things are clearer. The proportions are different from when you were in the middle. From up here, the work looks smaller than it did when I was inside it. Not unimportant, but smaller relative to the other things. The relationships look larger. The conversations look larger. Ordinary Tuesday evenings, barely registered, now look like the actual texture of a life. Eleanor is still alive, a fact I take seriously every single day. She's 81 and slower. Her memory occasionally loses things, but she is still herself. She still has opinions, still laughs with her whole body, still moves as though she belongs. I feel love, delayed grief for years. I didn't see her, and enormous gratitude. My grandchildren know me. That matters to me in a way I didn't know it would. They know me as a person, not just a grandfather, but an actual human being. We have real conversations, and I treasure every one of them. David, Patricia, and Robert are good people, doing their best in this complicated business of life. My relationships with them are not perfect. There are real absences and gaps, but they are honest relationships, where both sides know who they're dealing with. If I had to identify the single thing I most wish I had understood earlier, it would be this: the life you are living right now, not the life you are planning or working toward. Not the life that will begin once the next goal is achieved, but this one, happening today. In these unremarkable moments that you are moving through without paying full attention. Because you are focused on where you're going rather than where you are, that is the actual life. That is all there is. The rest is preparation for a destination that will feel similar. The destination is never the point. The point is who you are while you're moving, and what you're paying attention to, and who can see you clearly enough to know the difference between the version of yourself you're presenting and the one you are. I think about that 9-year-old boy in Ohio sometimes. I feel tenderness for him, and some sadness, and mostly gratitude that his story kept going long enough for me to see where I'd made the wrong turns, and to, if not correct them, at least understand. The dahlias are still in the garden. Eleanor plants them every spring. They're an extraordinary red in September, the kind of color that makes you stop and look. And I do. I stop and I look every year, and I stay as long as the afternoon lets me. That's all I wanted to tell you.